In October 2021, two Nenets fishermen left the Russian Arctic coast on what should have been a routine trip into the Barents Sea. What followed became one of the most haunting survival stories in modern polar history. For 5 days, they were lost at sea. When land finally appeared, one of them was already dying. This is not fiction. This is a precise reconstruction based on interviews, official reports, and the testimony of the man who endured 36 days alone on a frozen island. His name is Pyotr Taiborya. His story is about silence, death, and the thin line between giving up and going on. October in the Russian Arctic was already a season of silence and waiting. But on that particular day, silence gave way to chaos. A brutal storm, roaring and unrelenting, struck the Barents Sea without mercy. Two Nenets fishermen, Pyotr Taiborya and his older cousin Sergei, had gone out that morning in a small motorboat. They had done this countless times before, navigating the freezing waters north of the Nenets autonomous okrug, where the sea met the sky in a desolate blur. But nothing in their memory prepared them for what came. The boat was a sturdy model built to withstand light coastal weather, but this was different. A sudden shift in wind, temperatures dropping, whitecaps swelling into rolling walls of water. Then, static. The GPS flickered and died. The radio followed. Within minutes, visibility dropped to a few meters. There was no horizon, only walls of water and wind and a sky gone slate gray. Pyotr remembered gripping the side of the boat with white knuckles, Sergei shouting over the wind, trying to keep them angled into the waves. They fought it for hours, soaked to the bone, eyes raw from the salt, and then as night swallowed the Arctic day, the motor began to cough. It gave out completely sometime in the dark. From then on, they were adrift. For 5 days, the boat spun on the chaos of the open sea, tossed like driftwood. There was no fire, no food, no water. Their winter clothes were packed away, useless, wet, or blown overboard. They huddled for warmth, backs pressed together. They took turns watching the emptiness, hoping for a shape, land, a ship, anything. But the Arctic offers no mercy. By the 4th day, Sergei had stopped speaking. By the 5th, he was unresponsive. His breath was shallow, his lips blue. When the boat finally struck ground on the desolate shores of Dolgiy Island, it was not with celebration, but the thud of finality. Pyotr dragged Sergei onto the rocky beach. He shouted, slapped him lightly, tried to force movement, but the cold had claimed him. The Nenets believe in the power of the land, in spirits that walk in the wind, in ancestors who whisper. Pyotr whispered to his cousin, asked him to wake. But Sergei was still. Above them, the sky stretched out in a vast, uncaring dome. Around them, nothing but stone, sea, and wind. Dolgiy Island was an Arctic wasteland, long, narrow, uninhabited. Not a tree in sight, just barren tundra, broken rocks, and salt-burned debris from decades of passing currents. That night, Pyotr lay next to Sergei's body on the rocks, his arms around him, using him for warmth in the only way that was still possible. He did not sleep. He couldn't. The wind screamed through the night. In the morning, he woke from a daze, lips cracked, eyes caked with salt and exhaustion. His body was sore, throat raw from thirst. He looked at Sergei. Still unmoving. Something broke inside him. He stood slowly, using the hull of the boat for balance. There was no help coming. There were no ships, no trails, no shelters, no food, no fire, no signal. Just him, this lifeless shore, and the unending wind. The morning of day 6 rose dim and gray, as if the world itself was unsure whether to bother shining. The Arctic sun stayed low on the horizon, casting long, cold shadows across the barren stretch of Dolgiy Island. Pyotr Taiborya sat in the gravel beside the upturned boat, his hands wrapped around his knees, eyes blank. Sergei's body lay a few meters away, his shape hunched and small against the immensity of the shoreline. He hadn't yet cried. Pyotr felt like he had slipped into some borderland between dream and death. His thoughts came slow. Hunger was a dull pressure in his gut, but thirst gnawed at him constantly, drying his mouth to a paste. His fingers were stiff, his legs like lead. The cold no longer bit sharply. It crept instead, steadily leaching warmth, turning sensation into numbness. He knew this was dangerous. He knew he had to move. The beach stretched in both directions, miles of flat stones, driftwood, and forgotten trash carried by decades of tides. There were no birds, no seals, just wind. Always the wind. By midday, he had managed to drag Sergei's body higher up the beach, above the tide line. There were no trees, no real way to bury him. The best Pyotr could do was cover him with rocks. Flat stones he gathered one by one with frozen fingers. He whispered as he worked, words of old Nenets' prayers mixed with sobs he didn't realize he was making. When he finally stepped back, the cairn looked pitiful, but it was something. A gesture. A place. "Stay warm, brother," he said aloud. "I'll be back." Whether it was a promise or a lie, even Pyotr didn't know. By the end of the day, the wind had picked up again. His hands were bleeding. The tips of his ears were numb. He needed shelter. Anything that would block the wind. He turned his attention to the rocks. Behind a shallow ridge, he found what looked like a small hollow, a dip between two boulders. There, shielded from one direction, he arranged the boat's broken seat as a backrest, stacking flat stones and old netting nearby to build some kind of crude wall. It wasn't a hut. It wasn't warm. But it was something to crawl into, something to not die in. That night, he lay wedged between the rocks, knees pulled to his chest. His breath came in foggy bursts. He pulled his jacket tight, though it was soaked and stiff. Sleep came and went in flashes, minutes at a time, interrupted by shivering. The cold was a presence now, a living thing that curled around him and whispered, "Stop." He didn't speak back. He was too tired. When he woke at dawn, it was day 7. He had survived a full day. He was alone. But he was not yet dead. And for the first time since the storm, Pyotr realized this. No one knew where he was. Day 7 began with pain. Not sharp, but dull and constant, like his body was slowly shutting down piece by piece. Pyotr's lips were cracked, his throat felt like sandpaper, and his stomach was an empty knot. The cold hadn't lifted overnight. If anything, it had grown heavier, sinking into the bones like regret. He stood slowly from the stone hollow he had turned into a crude shelter. The wind was constant, though not yet violent. Low fog drifted across the rocky plain beyond the beach, swallowing the landscape in ghostly silence. Dolgiy Island stretched ahead in 2 gray wings of nothingness. Rock, frost-hardened moss, scattered drift. A place forgotten by the living. He needed water. Instinct pushed him to search near the coastline. He wandered for an hour, checking low spots for pools or snowmelt, but there was nothing drinkable. Only salt water, cold, indifferent, endless. At last, in a pile of seaweed tangled with plastic cords and rusted net floats, he found a cracked plastic container, part of an old jerry can. He sniffed it. Salty. But when he tipped it, a thin stream of rainwater dribbled from inside a fold. He drank it all in 3 gulps, not caring about the taste. It barely helped. Food was the next problem. Hunger had become a kind of rhythm. It moved with his breath, pulsing behind his ribs. He scanned the beach for anything edible. His eyes caught bones, long, pale, stripped by time. Seal bones, likely. Next to them, kelp, dried, black, stiff as leather. He broke a piece off and chewed. It tasted like rot and iron but stayed down. A few more strips joined it. His jaw ached. The seaweed felt like chewing rope, but it quieted the gnawing for a while. Farther down the shore, he found another prize, an old knotted fishing net. Mostly shredded, but tangled in it were tiny bones, feathers, and crusted salt. A sign that birds had once landed here. He picked through the mess with frozen fingers, careful not to cut himself. There were no fish, nothing fresh. But there were possibilities. By midday, Pyotr's movement slowed. He returned to the rock hollow and sat in the lee of the wind. The silence was overwhelming. Even the sea seemed quiet, a distant hush like breath held too long. He spoke aloud, just to hear his own voice. "You'd laugh at me now, Sergei," he muttered, lips barely moving. "Eating seaweed like a deer, freezing my ass off in a hole." No answer came, of course, but in the stillness he imagined Sergei's face, wrinkled from squinting at the sun, eyes always joking even when he was serious. Pyotr clung to the memory, let it sit with him in the cold. Later, as twilight fell, he tried again to make fire. He had seen it done with rocks, flint against steel, but he had no steel, no tinder, just a few damp pieces of driftwood and a torn rag from the boat. He struck rocks together until his hands bled, until his frustration became sobs. Nothing. No spark. That night, sleep didn't come. The wind picked up again, howling like voices. Pyotr huddled into himself, his bones aching. He whispered prayers, old ones, half forgotten from childhood, to the land, to the sea, to the spirits, to anything. Day 8 began, not with light, but with movement, his own, slow and deliberate. He wasn't warm, he wasn't rested, but he was alive. And in the Arctic, that was enough. He whispered again to Sergei's cairn before venturing inland. Still here. The island gave no reply, just wind and silence and sky, and Day 9 broke with brittle clarity. The fog had lifted during the night, swept out to sea by a northern gust, leaving behind a horizon of terrifying openness. The wind had not died, but it had changed, colder now, sharper. It carried with it the scent of distant ice. Pyotr Taiborya emerged from his hollow shelter, bones aching, teeth clenched against the cold. The rocky landscape ahead looked almost beautiful in the morning sun, if one could forget the death in the air. He stretched carefully, muscles stiff from days of shivering, and then scanned the shoreline. His first thought, always now, was survival, water, food, shelter, fire. These were not abstract ideas anymore. They had become a kind of law, a new logic, a cold logic. He followed the curve of the island, boots scraping against loose stone. His feet had begun to blister inside wet socks, but he had nothing dry to change into. The boat held no supplies, only broken plastic, torn rope, and one half-crushed canister with sand in it. Still, he searched it again for the third time. Desperation made repetition seem reasonable. By midday, he found a thin stream, likely snowmelt or groundwater, that trickled down from a shallow cut in the island's terrain. The water was almost frozen, but clear. He dropped to his knees and drank with both hands, ignoring the sting in his cracked lips. It felt like a gift, like the island hadn't forgotten him yet. His next find was more morbid. While digging through a cluster of driftwood half buried in seaweed, Pyotr uncovered what looked like part of a whale's rib cage, bleached, heavy and towering even in death. Around it, more bones, and wedged between them, a rusted fishhook still attached to a sliver of line. Pyotr stared at it. In another life, it would have been trash. Now, it was hope. He pocketed the hook, rolled the line around a piece of driftwood, and returned to his rock shelter before nightfall. With what strength he had left, he reinforced the windbreak with more stones and lashed some canvas from the boat over the opening. It wouldn't hold heat, but it would shield him from the worst gusts. As darkness fell, he chewed on more kelp, his jaw protesting every bite. He sipped sparingly from his container, afraid the stream might vanish. Then he examined the hook again, under what little light remained. He imagined catching something, anything. The thought was enough to keep him awake long after the stars came out. That night, he dreamed of warmth. A stove glowing orange, his mother stirring soup, Sergei laughing with his head back, mouth wide open. He reached for them and woke with frost on his eyebrows. Day 10 dawned even colder. The stream still flowed. That was good, but his limbs had begun to swell at the joints. Pyotr flexed his fingers slowly, alarmed by the numbness. He knew the signs. His grandfather had lost toes once during a late reindeer trek. This cold was creeping into him like smoke. Still he stood. Still he moved. That day he searched for anything metallic, scraps, nails, old cans. He wanted a way to strike a spark, but even rusted trash was scarce. The island had long since digested the last shipwrecks. The only things the sea left now were bones and rot. By late afternoon, Pyotr climbed a ridge, a soft rise that gave him a view in all directions. Ocean, endless. The island sloped away on either side, barren, windswept, godless. And yet, he stood there for a long time. The wind howled, his stomach churned, his nose bled, but in that moment the act of standing itself became a declaration. "I am not done," he whispered. You hear me? Not yet. He didn't expect a reply. The island had given him water, a hook. It was more than many got. When night returned and the stars wheeled above in brittle silence, Pyotr lay in his stone cocoon, hands clasped over his chest like a man buried before his time, but he was not dead. Not yet. Day 11 opened, with frost layered across Pyotr's eyebrows, beard, and even the inner edges of his shelter. He awoke slowly, curled into himself like a wounded animal. His breath puffed out in clouds. His fingers wouldn't move at first. He had to sit in silence, blinking against the dull ache in his bones before he could stand. The water source still trickled in the distance, and his makeshift container held a few mouthfuls. It was enough to wet his throat. The pain in his stomach had dulled, replaced by something worse, a numbness. Hunger had stopped feeling urgent. It was now an emptiness, a constant ghost trailing his every step. He knew this wasn't good. It meant his body had begun adjusting, shutting down what it didn't need. Pyotr couldn't afford that. The day's first mission was clear. Try to fish. He took the rusted hook, still wrapped in its stiff line, and walked slowly to the northern shoreline, where rock shelves dipped into deeper water. There, beneath the wind, the sea lapped against stone in slow, cold breath. Pyotr tied the hook to a length of scavenged twine from an old net, using half-remembered knots his grandfather taught him as a boy. For bait, he chewed a strip of dried kelp until it softened, shaping it into something vaguely alive. He tossed the line into the water and waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. He shifted from foot to foot, clapping his hands against his sides for warmth. Occasionally he tugged the line. Nothing. Still he stayed. 2 hours. His feet had gone numb, his face stung with cold. But then he felt it, a faint jerk, a twitch against the resistance. His heart surged. He pulled. Something resisted, not heavy, but real. When he reeled the line in slowly, a gray, twitching shape appeared, barely longer than his hand. A fish. Thin, cold, and gasping. It was the most beautiful thing he'd seen in days. Back at the shelter, he didn't even try to cook it. There was no fire, no heat, no time. He cleaned it with shaking fingers using a sharp rock, scraping the scales into the wind. Then he bit into it raw. The flesh was soft, bitter, and cold, but it was food, real food, protein, salt. His body responded like it had tasted heaven. He devoured it in minutes, even chewing on the softer bones. It wasn't much, but it changed everything. For the rest of the day, Pyotr felt stronger. Not by much, but enough. He moved more easily, his head cleared. He sorted his finds, broken ropes, scraps of tarp, salt-soaked netting. He tied the netting into a crude screen and hung it outside the shelter to break the wind further. That night, he sat cross-legged in the entrance, watching the moon rise pale and sharp over the sea. The cold was still brutal, but it no longer felt victorious. "Thank you," he whispered. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to the island, the fish, Sergei, or something older. Day 12 dawned with new pain in his hands. His fingertips blistered and stiff. But he moved anyway. He gathered more seaweed, checked the stream, tried fishing again. No luck this time. But he didn't despair. The fish had given him more than calories. It had returned a sense of cause and effect. That actions mattered, that he could influence the outcome. That afternoon, Pyotr visited Sergei's cairn again. The rocks had held, no animal tracks nearby. He knelt and placed a small white stone at the base. "I caught a fish," he said quietly. "You'd have laughed. It was tiny, but I ate every damn piece of it." The wind moved through the stones like breath. As darkness crept in again, Pyotr returned to his shelter, heart slower, thoughts steadier. The stars were clear that night. He counted them until sleep took him. He dreamed of campfires, of his brother singing, of something waiting, far away but real. By day 13, Pyotr was learning that survival wasn't just about enduring pain, it was about negotiating with it. His body had become a patchwork of injuries, swollen joints, raw blisters, dry cracking skin, and joints that ached with every move. But what haunted him more than the pain was the emptiness that followed each failed attempt to find food. Hunger wasn't silent. It had a voice now. It spoke in the tightening of his stomach, in the dull ringing in his ears, in the way his mind wandered too often to the smell of fried bread or reindeer stew. He dreamed of food more than he dreamed of rescue. The wind had changed again. It now came from the northeast, carrying with it an almost invisible mist, a biting salt veil that soaked everything without warning. The shelter, already damp, was becoming wetter. Each stone was slick, the canvas from the boat stained darker every day. Mold crept in. Pyotr knew if he didn't find a way to dry it or reinforce it, he'd lose his only protection. But there was no fire. Still. He had tried again the day before, flinting stones, dry kelp, fibers from an old rope twisted into a nest. Nothing caught. Everything he touched seemed damp with the breath of the island. Even his own skin felt more like the flesh of something left too long in the rain. Day 13 was spent along the southern stretch of shoreline, where waves lapped against black pebbles and the bones of old whales jutted from the sand like monuments. Pyotr wandered there for hours, scavenging. He found the cracked handle of a knife, but the blade was gone. He found plastic bottles, most empty, but one still had a few drops of something oily inside. He smelled it cautiously. Diesel. He kept it anyway. Midday came. Then evening. He had not eaten since the fish. The hunger sharpened. It whispered, "Eat anything, eat the kelp again, eat the bones, chew the leather of your gloves." Instead, Pyotr sat in the lee of a boulder and forced himself to be still. The world was quiet, the kind of quiet that only the Arctic knows. Wind hissed, and the surf whispered, and beneath it all, there was nothing. No birds, no engines, no movement. He was alone, in the truest sense. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the last meal he'd shared with Sergei. It had been fish, too, cooked over an open flame. They had eaten in silence, watching the clouds roll in, neither one expecting the storm that would scatter their lives into this. That night, Day 13 turned to Day 14 without celebration. He found a small depression in the stone and curled into it. The wind tugged at his legs like a warning. Day 14 began with a tremor in his right hand. It wouldn't stop. He spent most of the day in a daze, walking a loop between the stream, the cairn, and the fishing spot. Nothing bit. The hook stayed cold and empty. The line drifted in the sea like a question with no answer. By late afternoon, the hunger had taken on form. His muscles were tight, his head felt full of smoke, and his vision sometimes blurred at the edges. He nearly tripped into the stream once, saved only by a sudden grab at a nearby stone. It was then, as he steadied himself, that he saw something bobbing near the tide line. A shape, low and dark. A bird. Dead. Small, likely a gull. Its feathers matted, wings stiff but not rotted. Pyotr rushed to it, his breath hitching. He turned it over. No smell of decay. The cold had preserved it. He hesitated only a moment. He carried it back to the shelter, plucked it, cleaned it with seawater, and tore into the flesh raw. The meat was stringy, tough, bitter, but it was meat. His stomach clenched with every swallow, but it stayed down. Later, he sat shaking, not from cold, but from adrenaline. He had eaten. Again. The island had taken his dignity, but it had not taken his will. As night fell over, Day 14, Pyotr stared at the stars, whispering things he did not understand. He cried, quietly, and let the tears freeze on his cheeks. Hunger still had a voice, but tonight it did not scream. It simply listened. Day 15 began like all the others under a gray, frozen dome of sky. Pyotr opened his eyes to find a thin crust of frost on his eyebrows and lashes. His back ached from the uneven stone, and his right foot throbbed with a new dull pain that had spread from the heel up to his calf. He rubbed it absent-mindedly, only half awake, then sat up with a grunt. The shelter was sagging. The canvas tarp he had stretched over the windbreak now hung like wet skin, dripping condensation. The mold had darkened, the sea murmured in the distance, the air was sharp, and the hunger, though dulled, was still there, prowling inside him. But something had changed. Yesterday's gull had stirred something. A line, a new rule. Anything that can be eaten must be. The body doesn't care about pride. The body only wants to keep going. Pyotr stood and walked with a limp down the stone path toward the shoreline. Each step hurt more than the last, but he moved anyway. Survival had become a rhythm now. Water, food, cold, silence. He drank from the stream, still flowing, and rinsed his face. The cold stung his cracked skin. It woke him better than sleep. His goal today was impossible. Fire. He had tried before, he had failed every time, but now the smell of that raw gull still clung to him. His stomach turned even thinking of eating meat that cold again. He needed heat. Just once. Just enough to burn the bacteria away. Enough to feel something like life. He laid out all his supplies: driftwood, fishing line, rope fibers, bird feathers, a strip of dried kelp, pieces of plastic netting, old bones, and the oily residue from the diesel canister. He pressed rocks together, tried to build a pit. Then he struck stone. And again. Hours passed. The sun reached its peak and began to fall. His hands bled, his breath steamed, the rocks sparked twice. But nothing caught. Not even the kelp. Everything was damp, too damp. He considered using the diesel, but he had no way to spark it, no ignition. Still, he worked. By late afternoon, he was shaking with exhaustion. His fingers barely obeyed him, but he kept striking stone to stone, teeth clenched, mouth whispering curses and prayers all mixed into one. Then a wisp. Smoke, tiny, faint, gone almost immediately, but it had been there. He tried again. Again! At last, the rope fibers blackened. A tiny curl of smoke drifted upward. Pyotr leaned close, too close, and burned his lip, but he didn't care. He blew gently. The blackened curl glowed red. It almost died. Then caught. A flame. A real flame. He fed it feathers, dry kelp, twine. The fire hissed, flickered, fought to live. He cradled it like an infant, shielding it with his body. The wind pushed. The flame hissed. But it didn't die. For the first time in 2 weeks, heat touched his fingers. He laughed, short, cracking, almost hysterical. The fire lasted less than an hour before he ran out of dry fuel. But in that hour, Pyotr warmed his hands. He dried his scarf. He even scorched the bones of the gull he'd eaten the day before, crunching them into powder and licking the calcium from his fingertips. It wasn't a fire for the night. It was a fire for the soul. He would name this day. Day 15, fire without flame. That night, lying in the hollow, he spoke aloud. I can make fire. That means I can live. And for the first time in many nights, he slept a little deeper. Not because he was safe, but because something inside had relit too. Day 16 did not begin with sound. It began with its absence. Pyotr awoke to a silence so thick it pressed on the skin. The wind had stopped. Completely. No waves. No creaking of ice. Even the distant gulls that sometimes circled overhead had vanished. That's when he saw it. Snow. Overnight, a thick frost had turned to flurries, and by morning, the island had changed color. Where there had been gray stone, now there was white. Where he had once seen skeletal bones, only vague mounds remained beneath powder. It wasn't a storm, just a soft, persistent snowfall that erased the world. Pyotr sat up, blinking. His breath misted in the cold, and flakes clung to his eyelashes. His shelter's canvas had caved slightly under the weight. He brushed it off carefully, mindful not to tear the already weakened tarp. Snow meant two things, danger and opportunity. Danger because his tracks were gone. Anything he'd cached, fish bones, old rope, containers, could now be hidden under snowdrifts. The stream might freeze soon, and the cold, already unrelenting, would now press harder. But it also meant water. Clean, abundant water. No need to walk to the trickle. No need to scrape salt crust from plastic. He cupped his hands and scooped snow into his mouth. It melted slowly, chilling his teeth. But it was fresh. So fresh. So clean it felt like forgiveness. He moved carefully that day, conserving energy. Every step was heavier in snow. His boots, already stiff, now soaked up meltwater. But the white blanketed the harsh landscape, softening its edges. It was almost beautiful. He spent the morning rebuilding the fire pit. The flame from yesterday had given him more than warmth. It had given him belief. He gathered what little dry material he could salvage from beneath driftwood and rocks. Rope fibers, old netting, feathers, bone shards. He protected it beneath an overhang, drying some of it by wrapping it in cloth and tucking it against his body. He did not try to spark fire again, yet he needed to ration his energy. His hands had blistered from the last attempt, and the numbness in his fingers lingered. Instead, he stored his kindling, arranging it like sacred objects. At midday, he went looking for more food. The snow made it harder to search. Bones that once lay scattered now hid beneath white. Still, he scoured the beach. He overturned driftwood. He lifted rocks. Then, tucked beneath a tangle of seaweed and plastic, he found something unusual. A crushed plastic bag containing pieces of dried, salt-hardened fish. His heart lurched. He pulled it open with shaking hands. The pieces were thin, tough, almost fossil-like. They might have been weeks or even months old, but they had no visible rot, and they smelled like sea and time. He bit off a piece, chewy, salty, harsh, but it stayed down. That night, back in his shelter, Pyotr shared the fish with the wind. He ate one piece and stored the rest in a cracked container. Then he pressed snow into his can and let it melt slowly against his chest for water. The moon did not show. The clouds were thick, but the quiet was total. He lay awake a long time, staring at the white roof of his shelter. There was no fire, but he felt warmer. "Sergei," he whispered into the dark. It snowed. He imagined Sergei's laugh, low and hoarse, saying something about luck finally turning. Day 17 came with a sound, a single high-pitched crack from the distance, ice shifting, the land reminding him this was not over. The snow was not peace. It was a new phase. But Pyotr had learned this. White silence is still silence, and silence, if you listen long enough, tells you how to go on. He would listen. Day 18 arrived not with hope, but with repetition. The same sky, low, gray, unmoving. The same sounds, wind over snow, surf breaking at a distance, the faint rustle of frozen canvas. Pyotr awoke inside his stone shelter with his arms wrapped tightly around his chest. He could feel the crust of ice forming at the seams of the tarp again. His fingers were swollen from cold, the joints puffy and red. He had stopped counting on rest to restore him. Sleep now came in shallow, broken waves. But something small had changed. In his arms, he held a new priority: the fish. The dried chunks he had found the day before were now his most valuable possession. He examined the fragments in the dim light, a bit of fin here, a cross-section of spine there, all leathery and curled from age and salt. In total, maybe 100 grams of actual meat. But rationed correctly, it could last. He cut one piece into 3 and allowed himself the smallest third. It tasted of nothing but survival. His stomach groaned like a cave as it accepted the offering. Outside, the wind had settled into a near-constant moan. The snow that had fallen the day before had started to crust. Underneath it, Pyotr could still make out the faint ridges of the path he'd been walking for days, shelter to stream, stream to shore, shore to cairn. He walked it again, like ritual, like religion. He paused at the cairn. "I've got fish," he told Sergei. "And snow. Not much else." He looked at the stones. Some had shifted slightly in the cold. He adjusted a few with trembling hands. Then he stood still for several minutes, watching nothing. In the afternoon, Pyotr returned to the shoreline to forage. The snow made it hard, but the tide had receded slightly, revealing a scatter of debris further out on the black gravel. There, driftwood. Not much. Just one large plank and several smaller splinters, sun-bleached, sea-worn, and tangled with dried seaweed. He rushed to gather it, working quickly before the tide turned. The plank was old, part of a crate or boat wall, maybe. He dragged it back up the beach, slipping more than once, knees buckling under the weight. But he made it, back to the shelter, back to the fire pit. His fingertips were raw by the time he began breaking the wood. The smaller pieces snapped easily, the plank he worked at with a stone, wedging cracks into its softest grains until it began to splinter. He prepared the fire carefully, rope fibers, dried feathers, crushed netting soaked lightly in leftover diesel. A spark, 2, 10. Finally, smoke, then flame. He fed it sparingly. A slow burn. just enough to warm his hands, dry his scarf again, and toast a single piece of fish. It hissed in the heat. The smell was sharp, even appetizing. He savored it. Then, when the fire died, he buried the ashes with snow, rearranged his shelter, and curled inside. A new plan had taken root in his mind. Stretch the food, one bite at a time. Stretch the fire, one driftwood stick a day. Stretch the days. He didn't dream that night, but he didn't tremble either. Day 19 came quietly, and for once Pyotr greeted it with purpose. He set out immediately to find more wood, checking rock piles and frozen seaweed tangles, nothing as large as yesterday's find, but enough fragments to keep the fire alive. Briefly. That evening, he built another fire. He toasted another sliver of fish. He whispered again to Sergei, "I'm learning how to last." And even the wind, which had howled so cruelly before, now seemed to settle into a slow rhythm, matching his breath, matching the sea. He was not warm, he was not full, but he was not done. Not yet. Day 20. The 20th sunrise on Dolgiy Island. Though Pyotr couldn't see the sun, it was buried again behind layers of Arctic haze. The sky was colorless, not gray, not white, just blank, like a wall of silence pressed against the earth. The fire from last night had long gone out. A pale ring of ash was all that remained, and the warmth had left his stones hours before. Pyotr sat upright in the shelter, legs stiff, arms folded across his chest. The cold had gone deeper, not just on his skin, but in his joints, in his chest, in his breath. It was ice in the bones now. He moved slowly, carefully, stretching fingers that felt like frozen sausages. The stiffness didn't fade. It pulsed, a rhythm of dull pain each time he flexed or stepped. His right foot, already sore for days, was turning darker along the toes. He knew what that meant. Frostbite. But he didn't look too long, didn't let the thought settle. Instead, he reached for his remaining dried fish ration and stared at it like it was treasure. One piece left, no more than the size of a matchbox. He'd eat half today, the rest tomorrow. Maybe. He chewed slowly. His jaw ached from the toughness. His tongue barely registered taste anymore. But the food landed in his stomach, and that was enough. Water was easy now. The snow was clean, fresh, ever-present. He packed it into a scrap of plastic and left it inside his coat to melt. He'd drink it slowly, let it slide down his throat with purpose. Snow had become his most reliable companion, quiet, harmless, sustaining. Afterward, he limped along the familiar loop: shelter, stream, shoreline, cairn. At Sergei's cairn, he stopped longer. The stones had shifted again in the wind. He rebuilt them, smoothed them, took time doing it. 20 days, he whispered. Can you believe that? He imagined Sergei replying, "What are you waiting for? A medal?" The wind didn't bite that day. It pressed instead, slow, consistent, a pressure against the eardrums and the ribs. Pyotr sat near the shore for nearly an hour, watching the tide roll in and out like a breath. He was searching, not for rescue, not anymore, but for signs, anything that might help him survive day 21. That's when he spotted the barrel. Far down the curve of the island, half buried in the snow and kelp, something large and rounded had been pushed ashore. It wasn't there yesterday. Adrenaline woke him. He scrambled to his feet, limped toward it. Plastic, cracked, an old oil drum, black and dented, but inside, miracle, rope, bits of styrofoam, and a sealed tin. A tin. It had no label, no ring pull, just rusted edges, but it was intact. He carried it back like an offering to a shrine, sat in his shelter and examined it with shaking hands. He used a sharpened rock to chip away the seal. It took 30 minutes. Then, hiss. The tin opened. Inside, pale chunks in cloudy oil. Fish. Preserved. Real. He stared for a long time before tasting it. It was oily. Salty. Software. It was divine. He ate only a third, sealed the rest, buried it in snow. That night, he burned the remaining splinters from the driftwood pile. Just enough to warm his hands. Just enough to believe again. 20 days. He whispered it to himself again and again. I'm still here. And the wind, low and slow, sounded for once like it agreed. Day 21 dawned with the sound Pyotr hadn't heard in days. Gulls. At least 3 of them circled overhead, cutting arcs in the flat gray sky. Their cries were sharp, desperate, familiar. The kind of noise you could only hear far from cities. Honest, ugly noise. Pyotr opened his eyes in the shelter, still clutching the half-buried tin of preserved fish like it was a sacred relic. He let the sound settle in. Something was shifting. His joints hurt worse than ever, especially the right foot. He finally pulled off the stiff, salt-crusted sock and saw what he had feared. 2 toes, blue at the tips. The skin around the nail was blackening. A clear ring of deadness marked the line between warm blood and what was no longer alive. He didn't scream, he didn't curse. He just stared, and then slowly pulled the sock back on. It was survival now, not comfort, and pain meant he was still alive. He ate a quarter of the preserved fish. Every bite was deliberate. He let the oil coat his throat, felt the heat it stirred in his stomach. He buried the rest again, deep into the snow outside the shelter. Then he climbed. There was a ridge farther inland, just beyond the stone cairn where Sergei lay. Pyotr had eyed it for days, but hadn't dared the energy cost of ascending it. But now he needed to see. Not hope, just certainty. Even if it showed only more sea, more sky, he had to know. He limped, badly. The frost-bitten foot protested every shift in weight. But step by step, he made it. The wind thickened the higher he went, and soon fog rolled in. Thick, wet, moving like a curtain pulled too close. At the top he saw nothing, only fog. The ocean was gone. The horizon gone. Dolgiy Island reduced to a smudge in a bowl of milk. He waited. 10 minutes. 20. The cold cut into his teeth. Still he waited. Then, faint. So faint he thought it was memory. He heard something. A low thrum. Mechanical. He turned his head, straining. The fog played tricks. Maybe it was just wind, but then again, the thrum. Like a helicopter. Distant. Brief. Then gone. He stood frozen. Was it real? Was it hallucination? He didn't know, but it stirred something violent in his chest. He stumbled back down the ridge, heart pounding, breath ragged. He needed a signal, something visible. That afternoon, Pyotr tore what remained of the tarp from his shelter and dragged it across the snow toward the ridge base. He found an open patch of flat rock and laid it out like a banner. Then he used broken bones and sticks to form an X next to it. Next to the signal, he placed the brightest item he had. A piece of yellowed plastic from the barrel. He weighted it all with stones. He stood back. The fog swallowed everything. But maybe, just maybe, something would see. That night he didn't light a fire. He kept the splinters dry. If a rescue came, he would need them to create smoke. He slept poorly. His foot pulsed. His dreams were wet and gray, filled with voices that didn't speak. Day 22 came. No rescue. No more sounds, but the signal was still there. And Pyotr had not stopped moving. He whispered aloud to Sergei's cairn. I heard them. Or I didn't. But I'm still listening. And the wind, thick with fog, whispered something back that he couldn't quite understand, but believed. Day 23 came with darkness. Not the kind of darkness that comes from the Arctic night, but something internal, a shadow that seemed to stretch from Pyotr's ribs into his thoughts. He opened his eyes and knew immediately. Something was wrong. The shelter was colder than usual. His limbs ached with a deep, unmoving stiffness, and his right foot, he couldn't feel it at all. He sat up slowly and unwrapped the stiff sock. The sight was worse than he feared. The blackness had spread, 3 toes now, not just 2. The skin around them had split open in jagged cracks, revealing deep purple flesh underneath. It didn't bleed. That scared him more than blood would have. He wanted to scream, but he didn't. He just closed his eyes and wrapped the foot again, tighter this time, using a strip of his undershirt. The pain had retreated, which meant the nerves were giving up, a bad sign he wouldn't last much longer walking. Which meant he had to use his strength while he still had it. The fog from the day before had lifted slightly. The sky above was a matte sheet of iron, but visibility had improved. He crawled out of the shelter, dragging his body half upright, and checked the signal site. The tarp and bones had held. The yellow plastic was still visible. No footprints, no sounds, no echo of a rotor, nothing. Still he added more stones to the X, bigger ones, dragged them from the shoreline with arms that trembled. He rearranged the driftwood splinters into a rough square. Future firewood, maybe smoke. He ate the last of the canned fish that day. Not all of it. He left one tiny piece frozen in snow, too afraid to finish it. A symbolic ration, hope stored in a mouthful. At the cairn he knelt longer than usual. His lips were too cracked to speak much. Instead he laid a single bone across the top stone. A gesture. Something from himself, something real. "Still here," he whispered. The wind didn't answer, but it didn't argue either. That evening, the sky darkened faster than usual. Snow began to fall again, slow, heavy flakes like ash. Pyotr covered his fire materials with plastic and pushed the driftwood inside the shelter. His foot throbbed faintly now, just enough to remind him it wasn't gone. Yet. He thought of home. His mother used to make tea by boiling pine needles when he was sick. She said it cured everything. He could almost smell it. The sharpness of the steam, the rattle of her spoon. He dreamed of her that night. She was sitting on a bench beside a stove, calling his name, but he couldn't answer. Every time he opened his mouth, a gust of snow would blow in. She waited patiently, but she never moved closer. Not once. Day 24 began with blood. He tried to stand, collapsed, tried again. When he finally got up, the edge of his vision had gone white. Tunnel vision. His body was starting to starve in earnest. He chewed kelp that had frozen to the inside of the shelter. It scraped his tongue, tasted like sand. He swallowed anyway. Then he dragged himself to the ridge. No fog, only sea. And then, just on the edge of the southern horizon, something sharp. A flicker of motion. He squinted. It vanished. A ship, a plane, a cloud shadow. He didn't know, but it was something. He crawled back, built a fire, the small one. Smoke, not heat, was the goal. The plume rose, thin but steady. He sat by it, shaking, foot wrapped, lips cracked, eyes burning. He stared at the smoke until it faded into the black sky. Then he whispered, "Please." Not to God, not to Sergei, just to the world. And he waited. Day 25 started in stillness, not peace. Never peace, but the stillness of a mind exhausted past fear. Pyotr awoke, with his hand pressed against the frozen plastic can that once held snowmelt, now dry. The inside of the shelter was dim, shadows layered in frost. His breath came slow, thin. Each inhale rattled like dry leaves. He didn't sit up right away. Instead, he stared at the ceiling, cracked tarp, dangling rope fibers, a feather snagged in a seam. His foot pulsed with dull, distant agony. The infection had started. He could feel it now, not just in the limb, but in the way his thoughts slipped out of order. He whispered aloud, "Wake up." But the voice barely sounded like his own. Outside, snow drifted lazily, flurries floating in lazy spirals. The signal remained, tarp spread wide, stones forming an X, yellow plastic still visible. It was all there, all perfect, but the sky above it was blank. Pyotr forced himself to eat, the last shard of dried kelp, a frozen fish scale he found clinging to the bottom of the tin. He let it melt on his tongue like candy. It wasn't enough, not even close. And yet, he moved, not fast, not fluid, but forward, down the ridge path, past the cairn. His breath fogged the air, the ground crunched beneath him. He reached the shoreline and stared into the gray beyond. Everything, sky, sea, snow, had blended into one. No horizon, no contrast, just layers of cold. Then he heard it, a sound, low, rhythmic, thudding. He looked up, eyes straining, his heart kicked hard in his chest. There, on the edge of perception, a shape, no, not one, two, dots, moving, fast, helicopters. He fell to his knees, fumbled for the fire materials, threw feathers, netting, broken driftwood into the pit. His hands shook too much to strike the stone. "Come on," he whispered. "Please." The sound grew louder. The snow danced around him, wind rising. Finally, flame. A spark caught, then smoke. He fed it everything, clothes, a sleeve from his coat, anything that would burn. The fire flared, then billowed thick black smoke. He stood up, waving his arms. "They're here!" he screamed. "Here!" One of the dots turned, closer. He waved again, collapsed, stood again. Smoke rose like a pillar. The wind shifted. The helicopter was overhead now. He saw the door, the red cross, a face, then nothing, just the snow. He woke hours later in a white room. Blankets, lights, beeping, voices speaking Russian softly nearby. "You're awake," someone said. "Peter, you're home." He tried to speak. His throat refused, but tears came easily. He had made it. 36 days later, Pyotr Taiborya was alive, and the gray beyond had become something else entirely. A sky with color, a silence filled with breath, a life returned, and behind it, far to the north, a frozen island slept beneath the snow, unchanged, uncaring. But it had not won. Day 26. There was no wind that morning, no howl across the island, no snow against the tarp, just silence. And not the peaceful kind. This was the kind of silence that makes a man feel forgotten. Pyotr opened his eyes slowly. Everything hurt, not sharply, but like rust, settled deep in joints, in muscle, in the mind. His right foot was wrapped tightly in a strip of scavenged cloth. He didn't unwrap it anymore. What lay beneath wasn't useful, wasn't part of the plan. It was dead weight, literally. He tried to sit up. His ribs cracked. His vision dimmed at the edges. He leaned forward, forehead to knees, until the dizziness passed. Then he reached blindly for snow, packed it into his mouth. It melted slower now. His body didn't generate the same heat it used to. He was colder all the time. When he finally crawled out from under the tarp, the air felt thick, damp, the kind of cold that didn't bite, but settled. The signal fire remains were still visible, a blackened pit, a circle of char. But the wind and snow had erased much of the X he had built days earlier. Stones shifted, plastic bent. He couldn't rebuild it, not yet, not today. Instead, he crawled to the beach. Not walked. Crawled. His right leg dragged behind him, boot heavy with ice and blood. He moved like an injured animal, hugging the ground, pressing his face to snow, gritting his teeth to keep from groaning. By the time he reached the tide line, he was soaked, exhausted, shaking. There was nothing there. No new debris, no fish, no birds. The sea looked as dead as the sky. He lay flat on his stomach for a long time, staring at the horizon, waiting. Not sure for what. A mistake in the clouds. A flicker, a sound, a shape. Nothing came. Eventually he turned onto his side and stared at a piece of driftwood near his hand. It looked like a jawbone, bleached. Worn smooth, not human, probably seal. He picked it up anyway, rolled it in his fingers. In the absence of food, the mind begins to feed on symbols. That night, he sat by the broken fire ring and tried to spark flame, just to see. His hands trembled, his arms barely lifted. He got a spark, once, then nothing, no strength to press. He gave up, pulled the tarp tight around himself and lay in the rocks, curled against the cold. He spoke aloud, voice ragged. Day 26. It sounded like a confession. Day 27. He woke with blood in his mouth. He had bitten his cheek in the night. His lips were split. His breath whistled. He crawled again, to the snowbank he used for water. Scooped, chewed, swallowed. There was no food. The last scrap of anything edible had been days ago. He had chewed kelp until it shredded his gums. Tried licking stones for salt. He'd even considered the netting, but it tasted of oil and rot. That day he stayed inside the tarp. He watched a beetle crawl across the rock. He didn't kill it, didn't have the energy. Day 28. He woke to wind, sharp, cutting wind from the north. It howled over the ridge and ripped at the signal tarp. His shelter flapped violently, snow whipped sideways. He couldn't see the beach. The air was white. He thought, this is the day I die. But he didn't. He lay still, covered himself in rocks and canvas, closed his eyes and counted heartbeats. They were slow. Too slow. But they continued. In the storm, he whispered, "If you want me, take me." The island didn't answer, and that meant one thing. He was still meant to stay. Day 29th. It had stopped snowing, but the cold had sunk deeper. Pyotr no longer knew what time meant. He tracked days not by sunrise, but by the rituals of pain, when the dizziness returned, when the muscle cramps began, when the thirst sharpened after swallowing mouthfuls of melted snow. If he slept, it was for minutes. If he dreamed, they were flickers of memory. His sister's laugh, Sergei smoking by the river, the feeling of holding a hot mug in winter. That last one made him cry in his sleep. Today he whispered again. Day 29. Saying it made it real. Naming it kept him from slipping into something soft and final. He checked his foot, or what was left of it. The cloth was stiff. The smell, sour and earthy, told him what he already knew. The toes were gone. The infection had crept up like mold in a cellar. He didn't touch it, didn't try to cut. He wasn't a surgeon. He was just a man under a tarp, half buried in snow, whispering numbers to stay alive. That afternoon, he crawled again to the fire pit, just to sit, just to remember what fire had looked like. The ashes were frozen over, the stones cracked with ice. He traced them with his fingers. Somewhere in the motion he saw movement, a shape, not human, not even large, a bird, a black one, perched on a rock 20 meters away. It looked at him, head tilted, then another, two. They didn't land, just watched, waiting. He laughed, or tried to, his throat caught halfway. Too early, he rasped at them. You're early. They didn't move. That night he dreamed of the sea rising up and speaking in Sergei's voice. You think this is all for nothing? And Pyotr had no answer. Day 30. He woke to sun, not warmth, never warmth, but light, real golden light breaking through thin clouds. The tarp glowed faintly above him. He reached a hand toward it, felt nothing, and still smiled. He pulled himself out, sat blinking in the pale sun. The wind was low. The signal tarp was still there, ragged but upright. The stones still made their X. He breathed, slowly, deeply. He chewed more snow, watched the horizon, no ships, no helicopters, but no storm either, and that felt like a gift. He turned toward Sergei's cairn, couldn't crawl to it, not that day, but he looked long and hard and said, Still here? Then, as if the island had rules of its own, a gull passed overhead, alone, silent. He watched it until it disappeared into the white, and he whispered, Day 30. He didn't cry. He just counted another heartbeat. And then another. And another. Day 31. The sun was gone again. Pyotr awoke to a dull sky and air that had settled back into its cold grayness. But something was different. Not outside. Inside. His chest was tight. He coughed dryly, a sound like paper tearing, and realized his breath whistled on every inhale. Something deep inside his lungs had thickened. He could feel it. He pressed a hand against his ribs and winced. Pneumonia? He didn't know. He wasn't a doctor, but the body always tells you in its own language. He tried to sit, failed, tried again, managed it. His joints popped as he moved, as if each motion was a negotiation between life and inertia. Snow had blown into the edges of the tarp overnight. His sleeping place was wet now, slush-soaked, and the chill had crept into his spine. He grabbed a handful of snow and let it melt in his mouth. Water was all he had. Water and breath. He whispered, as always, Day 31. Even saying it felt heavier now. The number meant something. It meant the world had turned a full cycle more and still had not noticed him. He spent most of the day lying still, conserving energy. His body twitched now, involuntarily. Fingers flexed without meaning. His thoughts wandered in loops. He would start remembering his sister's kitchen, the smell of boiled potatoes, then suddenly he was back in the ice, the scream of the first storm. Sergei's voice cut short. He tried not to speak aloud anymore. His voice was so raw it burned. That evening, the snow began again, light but steady. He watched flakes fall through the opening in his tarp like stars changing their minds. Day 32. He had stopped dreaming. Or maybe he just couldn't remember. It was all haze now, soft edges of reality. His world had shrunk to a radius of 2 meters, tarp, snow pile, fire pit, sky. His leg had swollen. The boot could no longer be removed. He could feel the limb throb constantly, like a second heart below the knee. A hot ache. He pressed a stone to it, hoping to numb it. Nothing helped. At midday he tried to move, crawled, slowly, painfully, out of the tarp. His hands were too weak to grip much, but he dragged himself to the signal stones. One had been buried by snow again. He pulled it free, rearranged it, then slumped beside it, head on the frozen rock. He looked up. Clear sky. For the first time in over a week, not cloudless but high, open. He could see depth in it, layers, dimension, a sky not pressed flat but lifting. He blinked at it for a long time. Then he saw it. A trail, thin, almost invisible, but linear, human, a contrail, far above, across the upper sky, a plane. So high it made him dizzy to watch. He raised his hand, not to wave, just to reach. It passed in less than a minute. He lowered his arm and whispered, "Day 32. Then quietly, "I saw something." And for the rest of that day he lay on his side, in the snow, not moving, not sleeping, just staring at the sky where it had been, breathing. Because breath, at this point, was the only resistance left. Day 33. It began with wind again. Not the kind that shakes the tarp or screams down from the ridge, but the slow, steady wind that sounds like breathing. Pyotr heard it before he opened his eyes. It filled the hollow space of his shelter with rhythm. A reminder that the world was still in motion, even if he barely was. He tried to sit. His ribs objected, stiff and cracked with each breath. His spine didn't want to unfold, but he managed it, inch by inch, until he was upright. He didn't say the number aloud, just thought it. Day 33. He chewed snow. His tongue was raw from cold. His lips bled when he touched them. His beard was stiff with frost. No food, no fire, no birds. But the air had cleared, and that somehow mattered. That day he made it to the cairn. It took an hour of crawling, half sliding, resting every few meters, but he reached it. The rocks were half buried, snow packed in the crevices. He didn't speak. He just rested his forehead against the topmost stone and stayed like that for a long time. He imagined Sergei laughing again, not mocking, just amused. He could almost hear him say, "You stubborn bastard, you really came back." Then the memory shifted. Pyotr saw the first storm again, the wave that nearly took the boat, Sergei shouting, the moment the engine died. He opened his eyes. Snow. Still snow. He turned his head. The sea was quiet, no movement on the water, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt expectant. He crawled back before nightfall. His body shook the entire way. He collapsed inside the tarp and didn't move again for hours. Day 34, he spoke again. Day 34. It surprised him. His voice still worked. He looked up. The tarp had shifted slightly in the wind. A gap opened at the top, showing a slice of sky, pale blue. Almost white, but open. His foot was useless now, completely numb. His fingers tingled. He pressed one against a stone and felt no pain. He thought, "That's not good." Still he moved. He rebuilt part of the signal 10. Just a little. Dragged one bone back into position, adjusted the plastic tarp, smoothed the stones with bare hands. It wasn't strength. It was reflex, like an animal cleaning its den before dying. He sat beside the fire pit. No spark today, no kindling, but he could still sit. He imagined someone flying overhead, seeing the signal, wondering who could have survived this long. Then the thought hit him. Someone else might come here one day, a stranger, a fisherman, a pilot forced to land, a researcher, and they might see the cairn and the fire pit and the shelter. They might not know his name, but they'd know someone had lived here, had endured here. And maybe that was enough. That night he whispered again, "I'm still here." The wind did not argue. The snow did not fall. The sky stayed open long into the dark, and Pyotr watched it as long as he could keep his eyes open. Because at this point, even watching the sky was resistance. And resistance was life. There was no sunrise, just a thinning of the black into something softer, something gray. Pyotr opened his eyes to that change, and for a moment he thought he had gone blind. Everything was white around him. The tarp above his face, the frost on his cheeks. The snow drifted along the shelter walls. He was still breathing. That surprised him. He moved one hand, then the other. Pain. Yes, that was good. Pain meant blood still moved. His legs numb, his right foot. He didn't check. He didn't need to. He knew. Whatever was there now was not a part of him anymore. It was cold bone wrapped in cloth. And memory, he whispered, "Day 35. He smiled as he said it, a cracked, frozen smile. 35 days. He didn't think it was possible. That day he didn't crawl far, just outside the shelter. Just enough to stretch, to breathe something that felt less like air and more like forgiveness. The wind had dropped to almost nothing. The sky was vast. And in that sky, a thread, a line, contrail, again higher than the last, almost invisible, but real, human. He stared up at it with blurred vision. Tears came, not from emotion, but from the cold and the effort. He didn't wave, he didn't shout, he didn't have the strength, but he whispered, "I see you." And he hoped that was enough. Later, a shadow passed, not in the sky, but on the ground, a bird, then another. Scavengers. They circled, but did not land. Pyotr chuckled at them through cracked lips. "Not yet," he muttered. "I'm not meat yet." The wind picked up slightly in the afternoon, enough to bite, enough to chase him back under the tarp. He drank melted snow from a scrap of plastic. His fingers shook. His stomach growled weakly. He'd had nothing solid in days. He no longer felt hunger as pain. Just as a quiet suggestion, like a distant knock, he refused to answer. That night, as the cold pressed tighter than ever, he said aloud, "If I die tonight, fine. But not because I gave up." And then he slept. Day 36. He didn't wake immediately, not the way he had all those other days. Something was different, a sound, low, mechanical. At first he thought it was his heart finally breaking into something fatal, then louder, a distant roar, a rhythmic thumping, rotors, a helicopter. Pyotr tried to sit, couldn't, tried to yell, no voice. He grabbed for his fire pile, the last driftwood. He struck stone against stone, weak, useless. His hands barely worked. The wind scattered the powder, then spark, a twitch of smoke. He fed it netting, feather, scrap of cloth. The fire caught, thin, barely there, but it lived. He fanned it with his hands, stretched a sleeve into the flame. It blackened, curled, smoked. He stood, staggered. He waved the burning cloth above his head. The helicopter passed once, then again, lower, then hovering. He fell to his knees, arms up, smoke rising around him, voices overhead, then boots in snow, then hands, then heat, then dark. And in that darkness, as they lifted him away, Pyotr dreamed not of cold or death or the island. He dreamed of color, of soup, of music on a radio, of Sergei's voice saying, "You made it." And for the first time in 36 days, he did not wake alone. The sound of the rotors never really left his ears, even as Pyotr drifted in and out of consciousness, strapped tightly into the rescue basket. That thumping followed him into half-dreams. He felt the pull of a scent, not graceful, but jarring. The helicopter rose in short bursts, each jolt sending fire through his leg. He didn't cry out, he couldn't, his voice was gone. Inside the aircraft, they wrapped him in foil blankets, shouted words he couldn't process. Someone pressed a mask to his face. Oxygen! He'd almost forgotten what pure air tasted like. It burned going in. Pyotr opened his eyes only once during the flight. He saw one of the rescuers, young, wide-eyed, whispering into a headset. The man looked at him, startled to see him awake. Then he offered a short nod. Respect, a kind that went beyond language. Pyotr closed his eyes again. Not to sleep, to escape the sudden brightness, the noise, the overwhelming return to a world that had moved on without him. They landed in Naryan Mar. The hospital was a blur of light, hands, voices. People moved fast, efficiently. Someone took his temperature. Another began cutting away the rags that wrapped his foot. He heard a nurse mutter a curse. He didn't look. He didn't need to. A doctor leaned over him, middle-aged, gray-beard under a surgical mask. "You're lucky," the man said. "Most don't last more than a week out there." Pyotr wanted to laugh, wanted to say, "You think I don't know that?" But all that came out was a rasp. They hooked him to fluids, electrolytes, monitors. The fourth stung. He barely noticed. Time lost meaning. The first hours blurred into a fevered haze. He drifted in and out. Once, he dreamed someone was removing his foot with a dull knife. When he woke, they'd already taken x-rays. 2 toes. Definitely gone. The others maybe. "We'll try to save what we can," someone told him. Pyotr nodded. Not because he agreed, but because that's what you do when you're too tired to argue with pain. On the second day his sister arrived, she stood in the doorway, hesitant, as if afraid she'd shatter if she touched him. Then she rushed in and wrapped her arms around his shoulders. "I thought you were gone," she whispered. "I was," Pyotr croaked. She didn't let go for a long time. That night, he lay in bed, awake under soft sheets, trying to understand how cotton could feel so strange. His body no longer trusted comfort. Every softness made him brace for pain. The staff brought soup. He drank slowly, salt, warmth, a hint of meat. He wept, not loudly, not for the loss, but for the taste. 36 days of snow, kelp, and silence. And now, warmth. It broke something open. On day 3, the reporters came. They were kept out of the room, but he heard them. Cameras clicking in the hallway, questions lobbed at the nurse's station. How did he survive? What did he eat? Is he willing to talk? He wasn't. Not yet. The psychologist came that afternoon. She spoke gently, asked simple questions, his name, what he remembered, whether he'd seen hallucinations. Pyotr stared at her a long time, then said, "I watched the sky for days." "Does that count?" She smiled, didn't press. They called it a miracle in the newspapers. But Pyotr knew better. It wasn't a miracle, it was a war. And now at last he was home. But the war wasn't over. It had just changed shape. The 4th morning in the hospital came with sun through the windows and the soft beep of machines beside his head. Pyotr didn't open his eyes right away. He wanted to imagine, for just a few seconds, that the light meant home. Not this bed, not the dull white walls, not the IV in his arm, but the riverbank, the crackle of frost under real boots, the cold that came from air, not inside his bones. But the river didn't beep. So he opened his eyes. He tried to move his leg. Reflex. He regretted it instantly. Pain bloomed sharp and bright behind his eyes. Then the numbness returned, a soft hum in his right foot, or what was left of it. He pushed back the blanket, looked, bandaged, thick, sterile. The shape was wrong. His toes weren't there. The nurse came in without knocking, young, blonde, kind eyes. She checked his drip and smiled. "You slept through the night," she said. Pyotr didn't respond. She was used to that now. The silence wasn't personal. It was just how he existed. "How's the pain today?" He held up 2 fingers. "Better," she said. "That's good." He closed his eyes again. Not from pain, but to stop remembering. By day 5, the psychologist returned. Same soft voice, same notebook. "Do you remember everything?" she asked. Pyotr nodded. Slowly. She waited. He didn't speak. "You don't have to talk today," she said. "But when you're ready, we can start writing it down. That might help." He turned his head to the window. Outside, the clouds moved in long, slow stretches, like days on the island. When she left, he whispered, "There's nothing to write." It already happened. Physical therapy started on day 6. 2 orderlies lifted him gently, swung his legs over the bed, helped him into the chair. His muscles screamed. He used to carry boats, nets. He used to lift Sergei over rocks. Now he couldn't stand for more than 5 minutes. "Ghost muscles," the therapist called them. "They remember. They'll come back." Pyotr nodded, but he wasn't sure. What if they remembered the wrong things? What if they remembered hunger, cold, panic? What if every step forward pulled that memory back to the surface? They wheeled him down the hall, through rehab, past a TV in the waiting area. The sound was off, but the screen played footage of a helicopter lifting from a snowy beach. His beach. Pyotr turned away. On day 7, his sister brought him a coat. Wool, dark green, his favorite color. She sat beside the bed, placed it in his lap. "You'll wear it home." He stared at it, touched the sleeve. Thick, lined, warm. He remembered the thin nylon jacket he'd used to shield his legs at night, the pieces of tarp sewn together with cord. the fireless nights, the way the wind slipped into every seam. He said nothing. She squeezed his hand. "I know," she said, "but this one's real." That night, he dreamed of movement, not flight or running, just walking, along a ridge, boots in snow, footprints behind him. In the dream, he wasn't limping. In the dream, Sergei walked beside him. Neither of them spoke, but both of them looked up at the same sky. And it was clear. Day 8 in the hospital began with a knock. That alone made it different. Until then, people had simply entered, nurses, orderlies, doctors. But this time, someone knocked. Pyotr turned his head slowly. His neck still ached from sleeping at odd angles. His joints stiffened in the night as if the cold from the island still clung to them. The door opened, and a tall man stepped inside. Gray suit, no stethoscope, civilian shoes. "Mr. Taiborya," he said. "May I?" Pyotr said nothing. The man took that as a yes and sat in the chair near the window. He didn't pull out a notebook, didn't introduce himself beyond that question. Just sat there. They stayed like that for a minute. 2. Then the man said, "They're asking for an interview." Pyotr didn't respond. "Television Federal International. People want to know how you survived." Silence. "You'd be doing them a service, giving hope." Still nothing. The man adjusted his tie. "You've become a symbol, a man who endured." That made Pyotr look at him. Endured. He tried to speak, but the word wouldn't come. The man filled the silence. "You don't have to say yes. I just had to ask." He stood. Before he could leave, Pyotr whispered, "I buried my friend." The man froze. "I buried him with stones. I didn't even remember if I prayed." The man's face shifted, less certain, less scripted. Then Pyotr said clearer, "There's no symbol in that." The man nodded once. "Understood," then left quietly. Day 9 was quiet. They brought him a notebook. He stared at it all morning. The paper looked too clean, too expectant. He turned to the middle and started to write. Not a narrative, not a statement, just moments, images. Kelp between teeth. The way the sky curved on day 12, Sergei's hand, cold, smoke that wouldn't rise, the seagulls that waited. He filled 5 pages that way, then stopped. Day 10, he sat in a chair for a full hour, muscles trembling, his back stiff. But he didn't ask to go back to bed. His therapist came in and found him sitting there staring at the floor. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded. She smiled. "That's a win." Pyotr wasn't so sure. That evening, his sister brought him an old photo album. He flipped through slowly. Boats, ice, a dog long dead, himself younger in a heavy coat, Sergei in the background of one shot holding up a fish and grinning like a fool. Pyotr stopped at that photo, traced Sergei's outline with a finger. His sister said, "They're talking about a memorial." He didn't answer. "Would you go?" she asked. Pyotr shook his head. Then after a long pause, "Not yet." That night, no dreams, just silence. But it didn't echo the way it had on the island. It was a silence that held something, like waiting, like the first moment before speech, and Pyotr at last was starting to listen. By day 11, Pyotr could walk, not far, not fast, and not without the cane the therapist gave him, sturdy, aluminum, impersonal. But it was walking. They'd removed 2 more toes. The infection had spread farther than they thought, but the rest of the foot somehow held on. The surgeon called it a success. Pyotr wasn't sure what that meant anymore. Still, he walked down the hallway past the rehab center to the window at the far end. He leaned there, one hand on the glass, breathing in the faint warmth of the sun on the other side. Outside, snow melted in patches. The world was thawing. He wasn't sure if he liked it. On day 12, he opened the notebook again. He didn't write this time. He sketched, not people, not faces, just outlines, the stone X, the makeshift tarp, a seagull wing. He drew the shape of the coastline from memory, the angles of the rocks, the curve of the beach where they'd landed. On a new page, he drew Sergei's hands. Not his face, just the hands. holding rope, holding oars, holding nothing. He closed the book and sat back, surprised to find his chest tight. Not from pain, from something else, like missing a limb. Day 13, he took 2 steps without the cane. The nurse clapped. He grimaced at her. She laughed. "That's okay. You don't have to like it." He didn't, but that night he stood at the sink in his room and washed his face by himself, and the water was warm. It ran over his hands and down his wrists, and he closed his eyes. He whispered, "Still here." It wasn't a prayer, it was a statement of fact. By day 14, he was ready to leave his room. They took him downstairs, no cameras, no press, just his sister and the nurse, pushing a wheelchair he didn't want. They walked along the corridor until they reached the hospital courtyard. A small patch of trees. Snow still hung in their branches. A wooden bench sat near the far wall. Pyotr sat there for a long time, his sister beside him. No words. He looked at the snow, then up at the clouds. A plane passed overhead, thin line in the sky. He followed it with his eyes. No fear, no sadness, just a simple acknowledgement. I remember. That evening, they watched television together in his room. A nature documentary, Arctic wolves, wide tundra, empty white silence. His sister glanced at him. "Too much?" He shook his head. "No," he said. His voice cracked slightly. "It's true." She smiled. "Then maybe one day you'll tell them your version." "Maybe," he said, "but not today." He didn't need to be a story. Not yet. Just a man who'd been alone on an island and who now sat on a bench in winter with both feet touching the ground. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Day 15 marked a shift. Pyotr woke earlier than usual. The room was dim, the hall still quiet. The nurses changed shifts in muffled tones beyond the door. For the first time, he didn't wait for someone to help him sit. He did it himself, slowly, with one hand on the bed rail and the other on his cane. He stood, balanced, breathed. Then walked to the window. Outside, the world still looked cold, but not lifeless. There was motion now, meltwater dripping, birds perched along the fence line, cars passing in the distance, people moving through their days. He pressed his forehead against the glass. Alive. Still. Later that morning, he asked for a map, not a road atlas, a topographic one, of the Barents Sea, the islands, the place he now carried inside his body like scar tissue. The staff took some time to find it, but in the afternoon, a nurse brought it in, creased, dog-eared, smelling faintly of dust and plastic. He unfolded it on the tray by his bed, used one finger to trace the coastline. Nenets, autonomous Okrug, Pyotr Sea, Dolgiy Island. There, he marked it with a pencil, a faint cross. Not an X like the one he'd built with stones, but enough. A memory point. The nurse peeked in. "Planning another trip?" she joked. He didn't smile. "Just charting where I ended," he said, then paused. "Where I started again." That evening, he received a letter, not an email, a real envelope, hand-delivered, from a fisherman in Arkhangelsk. A stranger. The man had read about him in a local paper and had written by hand. "I once spent 3 days lost in the White Sea. I thought I was done. But I wasn't. You made it longer. I think I understand now that time doesn't decide. Will does." Pyotr read it twice, then set it on the table next to the map. Day 16, he walked without the cane. 4 steps, wobbly, painful, but upright. The physical therapist was overjoyed. His sister watched from the doorway, silent, eyes full. Afterward, he sat by the window again. The map was still open on his lap. He folded it slowly. Not to hide it, to preserve it. Then he spoke aloud to no one. "You can live in a place and not leave footprints." He didn't know where the words came from, but he knew they were true. That night, he slept without dreams. The map sat on the windowsill beside him. A reminder, not of what he survived, but of the place that had shaped him. A quiet map, for a man who had no need to tell the world everything, only enough to keep going. Day 17 came with mail, more letters, some typed, some handwritten, most from strangers, fishermen, schoolchildren, soldiers, mothers. One from a woman in Murmansk who said she prayed for him daily and enclosed a paper icon of St. Nicholas. Pyotr set them in a pile, unread. Not from disrespect. He just didn't yet know how to hold the weight of so many people's hopes. By noon, he was back in the therapy room. The exercises grew longer, the pain sharper. But his endurance had changed. He wasn't fighting his body now. He was learning how to speak with it again. Each repetition was a sentence, each ache, punctuation. Muscles are honest, the therapist said. They'll remember who you were, even if you don't. Pyotr wasn't so sure. He was no longer the man who left Nari and Mar by boat. He wasn't the man who stepped onto Dolgiy Island. And he wasn't yet whoever came after. He was in between, like snow that hasn't melted but is no longer fresh. Day 18. He walked the entire hallway without stopping. At the far end, a man waited, the psychologist, clipboard in hand. "You're further than last week," she said. "I know," Pyotr replied. "You've barely said a dozen words until now." He shrugged. "Didn't have anything worth saying." She nodded. They walked back together, slowly. Halfway, she asked, "What will you do, once discharged?" He didn't answer right away, then, "Not sure. But it won't be what I did before." She smiled. "That's fair." His sister brought him boots on day 19, custom-fitted, warm, soft-soled, designed to balance his altered foot. He put them on himself, stood, walked, then turned to her. "Let's go outside." The courtyard looked different now, not because the snow had changed, but because he had. It no longer resembled the emptiness of Dolgiy Island. It looked like a beginning. He sat on the same bench, closed his eyes, felt sun on his face, and for the first time didn't brace against the cold. He simply let it be. Day 20. A final evaluation. He answered the doctor's questions, performed the movements, endured the prodding. The words "discharge possible by week's end" were spoken. Pyotr nodded. No reaction. The staff brought a cake to celebrate his progress. Nurses clapped. Someone took a photo. He stood for it, not smiling, but not frowning either, neutral, present. Afterward, in his room, he finally opened the letter from the boy in Yakutsk. It said, "I read about you. My dad says you're tough. I think you're like the brown bear, slow but unstoppable." Pyotr folded the paper and placed it inside his notebook. He didn't feel like a bear, but he understood the image. Some things keep walking even after the trail ends. Some men come back not to be the same, but simply to continue. And that was enough. The morning of day 21 began with silence. No machines, no fours, no nurses entering before sunrise. For the first time in 3 weeks, Pyotr woke not to obligation, but to stillness. He lay in bed for a long while, watching the ceiling, listening to the building breathe. Outside the window, the snow had mostly retreated, revealing wet patches of brown grass and pavement. Spring was inching in. His discharge papers waited on the nightstand, signed. Final. He would leave tomorrow, but not yet. His sister arrived with a thermos of tea and a small bag of dried fish, real ones, not from the hospital menu. He smiled at her. "Luxury," he said. She laughed. "Don't get used to it. You'll be cooking your own next week." He said nothing but nodded. They sat in silence, sipping tea. The sun reached across the window and warmed the blanket on his knees. It felt like an old friend. "You ready?" she asked softly. "No," Pyotr replied, "but I'm going anyway." Later he asked the nurse for a pen. He opened his notebook to a blank page. At the top he wrote, "Things I carried back," then made a list. 1. Cold in my bones. 2. Silence in my head. 3. Sergei's voice. 4. The shape of the island. 5. The sky. 6. 1 unfinished breath. He closed the notebook, set the pen aside. That was enough for now. That evening, the hospital administrator came in with a clipboard. Forms, gratitude, offers. "Media wants to speak again," he said. "No," Pyotr answered simply. The man hesitated. "There's talk of an award, regional honor, even federal." "No," Pyotr repeated. The man adjusted his tie. "May I ask why?" Pyotr looked out the window. "I survived because I had to," he said, "not because I wanted to be remembered." The man left, respectfully. That night Pyotr dreamed of the sea, but not of storms. Not of the island, just the surface of the water, perfectly flat, a mirror. In the dream he walked along the shore, no pain, no cane, only sky above and waves beside. He didn't speak, didn't cry, just walked. When he woke, his heart felt quiet, not empty, just calm, like still water, and he was ready. Day 22 began not with dread, but with momentum. Pyotr stood early, dressed slowly, and placed the worn green coat over his shoulders without help. His boots were laced. His bag, small, worn, mostly empty, was ready beside the door. His sister arrived with a smile and teary eyes which she tried to hide behind motion. She signed a few forms, thanked the nurses, hugged the psychologist, then nodded toward him. "You ready?" He exhaled through his nose. "No," he said, and smiled faintly. "But let's go anyway." They left through the front. He insisted. The courtyard looked different in the morning. Frost kissed the grass, and a single bird, a raven maybe, watched them from a railing. No one made speeches, no reporters, just a nurse who waved from the second-floor window. Pyotr lifted one hand in return. That was enough. The car ride was quiet, not awkward, just shared silence. He watched the trees pass by, the power lines bending slightly in the wind. The rivers were still half frozen, glistening in the sunlight. An hour out from town, they stopped near the edge of a lake. He stepped out carefully. No cane now, just balance. He walked to the water's edge, bent slightly, picked up a stone, held it, then let it drop. "I thought I'd forgotten how to feel anything," he said. His sister stood beside him. "And?" "I was wrong." They reached the village before sundown. It looked smaller now, not from change, but from his own distance. The world he'd returned to wasn't the same. Children waved, neighbors watched from windows. One man stepped forward, offered a handshake. Pyotr took it, said nothing. Then went inside. The house smelled like dust and salt and memory. Everything was as he'd left it. Coat on the hook, stove cold. Calendar still open to October. He didn't cry. He didn't collapse. He just sat and breathed. That night, he stood by the window with a cup of tea and stared out at the sky. No helicopters, no seagulls, no voices on the wind, just stars. And beneath them, a man who had returned, not whole, not healed, but returned, and still standing. The morning after returning home was quiet. No beeping monitors, no measured footsteps of nurses in the hallway, just the faint sound of wind brushing against the windows and the slow creak of wood as the house warmed in the morning light. Pyotr sat at the kitchen table with a mug of barley tea staring at the blank wall across from him. Everything was where he left it months ago. The chipped enamel kettle, the faded calendar, the wooden spoon that never fit the drawer. It felt smaller now. Or maybe he had grown bigger inside. He stepped outside around mid-morning. The snow had receded into soft mounds under the trees. Mud clung to his boots. The air smelled of melt and pine. Children's voices carried on the wind from across the village. Dogs barked distantly. A chainsaw buzzed in the woods. Ordinary life. He stood there for a while, breathing, then turned back inside. By afternoon, he started cleaning, not as a chore, but as an act of reclaiming, wiping down shelves, folding clothes, repairing a loose latch on the back door. He moved slowly but steadily. His leg ached, but he welcomed it. It was real, honest work pain. Each action grounded him, proved he was not only alive but returning to living. He found Sergei's mug in the back of a cupboard. He didn't cry. He washed it, dried it, set it back where it belonged. That evening, he lit a fire in the stove. The crackling wood filled the room with sound and warmth. He sat by it, notebook in hand. This time, he didn't write memories. He made a list. What to plant this spring. How many boards needed for the roof. A new net for summer fishing. A second chair for visitors. Before bed, he stepped out once more. The stars blinked above. The wind had died. He heard only the trees settling. He whispered, "Still here." And in that moment, he didn't feel alone. Not haunted, not broken. Just a man in his yard under the same sky he'd watched for 36 days, and tomorrow he would build something. Not to forget, but because he still could. The days after returning home took on rhythm. Morning tea, stretching, a slow walk to the shed and back, notes in the notebook. A fire at dusk. Each day Pyotr added something. A task, a thought, a memory revisited on his own terms. He built shelves in the entryway, sorted through fishing gear, repaired a cracked oar, took stock of his tools. He didn't speak much, not to neighbors, not to his sister who came by with soup and news, but they didn't expect it anymore. Silence had become part of him. Not a shield, not a prison, just another language he now spoke. On day 24, he walked down to the edge of the river. The water still ran dark under the last slabs of ice. He watched it for a long time, eyes steady, heart quiet. Then he crouched and placed one hand in the current. It was cold, familiar. He didn't flinch. That night he sat by the fire and reopened the map he had folded in the hospital. Dolgiy Island was still marked, faint with that simple cross. He traced it again, then added another line beside it. Survived, and below that, witnessed. He didn't mean just the island, he meant the stars, the gulls, the empty air, the hours without sound, and Sergei, especially Sergei. The next day he walked to the village center, slowly but unassisted. People watched from windows, from shops. A boy offered him sunflower seeds. Pyotr accepted. Chewed a few, spat the husks. An old woman touched his sleeve. "You came back," she whispered. "Yes," he said, and kept walking. That evening, his sister showed him the article. Federal publication. Photo of him at the hospital door. Headline: "The man who endured the North alone." He read it once, then handed it back. "They got it wrong," he said. "What part?" "I didn't endure it. I lived through it." That night he went to bed early. The window cracked open. The wind carried sounds of shifting branches and far-off dogs. As he drifted to sleep, Pyotr thought of silence again. Not as something to fear, but as something to listen to. Because within it, he had heard his own name again. And that, more than anything, had brought him home. By the 30th day home, Pyotr had rebuilt a rhythm, but not a routine. He rose early, cooked simply, maintained his firewood, repaired an old net, wrote a single line each morning in his notebook, sometimes a word, sometimes a smell, sometimes just "still here." The words were not poems, they were confirmations, proof. He had come back from where few had been, and even fewer returned intact. Neighbors no longer stared. They greeted him with nods now, not questions. The story had moved on from headlines to whispers and then to quiet acknowledgement. He was no longer the man who survived the island. He was simply Pyotr again. It suited him. His sister stopped by with a radio and a loaf of black bread. He accepted both. They drank tea outside on the steps. "There's a veterans hall in the city," she said carefully. "They asked if you'd come talk." He sipped slowly. "Not ready," he said. "I told them that. They understand." They sat in comfortable quiet. Then she asked, "Do you ever want to go back?" He looked at her, not surprised. "Yes," he said, "but not now." That evening, he wrote more than usual. "I remember the shape of Sergei's shadow in fog. I remember my name inside my mouth when no one was there to hear it. I remember silence like a second skin." He stopped, closed the book, not from pain, from fullness. At night, he sat by the stove, flipping through the letters he hadn't read before. One from a boy in Novosibirsk who wrote, "I was scared once in the forest, but then I thought of you, and I kept walking." Pyotr smiled faintly. He folded the paper gently, placed it in the box beside the stove. Not to be forgotten, just not needed every day. Before bed, he stepped out into the dark. No wind, no clouds, just the stars. He whispered again, "Still here." But this time, he added, "Still me." And in that moment, under the same sky as before, Pyotr no longer felt like a survivor clinging to the past. He felt like a man standing in the present, with both feet on the ground, and only one chapter left. Spring arrived slowly like a tide. Patches of earth reappeared beneath the snow. Ice broke along the riverbank. The air softened. And Pyotr, now 36 days home, stood outside his house as the last frost receded. It had been 72 days since he left shore. 36 days lost. 36 days found. He marked the day not with ceremony but with action. He walked to the shed, pulled down a canvas, folded it, swept the floor, laid out a small bundle of gear, a knife, rope, a flask of tea. Not to leave. Not yet. Just to prepare. Because a man who had walked through death did not wait for life to knock. He built something. He repaired the second oar, sandpapered the edge, rewrapped the grip, sealed the crack with resin and cord. He hung it beside the door, not out of nostalgia, but respect. Not for the storm, not for the fear, but for the vessel that carried him back to land. That afternoon, he walked farther than he had since returning, beyond the tree line to the bluff overlooking the water. The sea stretched out before him, blue-gray and endless. He stood for a long time. Then he did something he hadn't done before. He waved, not at anyone, not for show, just a quiet gesture to what had been, and what would never be again. That evening, he wrote one final line in his notebook. "The island is no longer inside me, but the man I became there remains." He closed the cover, did not reopen it. He placed the notebook on the shelf beside the photo of Sergei, and beside it, a small stone he had once carried in his coat. The last thing from Dolgiy Island he had never spoken about. Now it didn't need explaining. It just was. He made soup that night, ate slowly, let the fire die low. Before sleep, he opened the window. The wind was soft, the stars held. He didn't whisper anything, didn't need to, because nothing was missing anymore, not a name, not a voice, not a path forward, only the light beyond the water and the quiet that comes when you know you've made it back.